Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Beckham. I'd like to show and talk through a few images that I shot in a local forest with a recently bought Canon R5 mirrorless camera. The main object of the exercise was to become more familiar with the new camera. To take our camera into the forest in bright and sunny conditions is not always the best of ideas. The problems we face in bright conditions in a forest is high contrast. When we see that dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, it looks great to our own eyes, but our images can often be disappointing. It's because the highlights have been recorded much brighter than we saw, and the shadows much darker. But once we're aware of that problem, we can try and compose our shots, keeping as many of the highlights out of the frame as possible. And of course we have to expose accurately to ensure the highlights are not made worse. There's something quite reassuring to be able to create some nice images from situations where some photographers may fail. Now, I'm not suggesting my images are perfect, far from it. But with just a little thought, we can capture good images even when the conditions are not perfect. In this shot, although I do have some highlights in the trees up at the top right, I've managed to find a location where I could point my camera slightly away from the harshest part of the sun. So there is in fact just a hint of blue in the sky. Finding a good composition is our next problem. Here I've used the tall trees on the left and the right, and the forest road to lead us into the picture. I think the track does add a little bit of mystery. What's around the corner? Well, more trees is the truth of it, but you get the idea. In this image we do have similar techniques to the last one. There are one or two highlights filtering through the trees at the top right. They're a little bit brighter than the previous shot, but I think they're within an acceptable range. Here we've got the leading of the road again, which is good. It's a shame the road wasn't bending to the left at the end rather than the right, because bending to the right, it's moving out of the picture. If it bent to the left, I think it would make the picture just marginally better. But we do have a really good, strong rule of thirds composition here, with the strong shapes and the colour of the tree on the left. This image is again very similar to the last one. In fact, I think it's the same track, we're just slightly further along. But we do still have the composition. We do have the three trees on the left, which gives us a nice starting point, and the track leading into the picture. And once again, a shame the track didn't bend to the left, but we can't win all of the time. Here we have almost no sky showing through, so we can always find some locations like this. Another viewpoint where I'm using exactly the same techniques, just a little bit of highlight coming through the trees here that couldn't be avoided. If you look very carefully at the top of the image, you can probably see a little bit of evidence of a graduated filter that I added in Adobe Camera Raw. The track also moves nicely into the picture from a strong compositional position, and it does tend to bend round a little bit to the left. It would be nice if there was a big bold rock at the end of that track, but we don't always get what we wish for. One interesting fact about this particular image: the lens I was using was a 24-105, but here it was zoomed to somewhere close to 50mm. The ISO was set to 100 and the aperture f11, which meant I had to use 1/6 of a second. So hand holding in the forest, even with a 50mm lens at 1/6 of a second, is a little bit risky, but it seems to have worked pretty well. Is that the in-body image stabilization working to my advantage? Well, I think I need a little bit more experience before I can fully claim that, but it's looking positive. Now this scene appealed to me. I liked the way the fallen trees just lying there rotting in the forest amongst all of the boulders was quite appealing, but it was just a little struggle to get a very good composition. But sometimes we can break the rules, and I think it still works up to a point, although I couldn't really claim a classic rule of thirds composition here, apart from the rock on the left hand side. What I do with my exposure in these situations is to squeeze as much light into the sensor as I possibly can, but without allowing the highlights, if there's any in the shot, to become blown out. Now, many will call this exposure to the right, and we can use the highlight warning on the LCD screen to tell us where this highlight limit is. What this technique does is to open up those dark shadows, and it makes the processing of the raw images a little easier and the resulting quality better. But it is a fine line we have to walk, because we need to squeeze as much light into the sensor but without burning out the highlights, which are always going to be a problem in these conditions in a forest. Something I almost forgot to say about this image. Because the object of the exercise was for me to take out the new camera and give it a practical run, with this image I set the ISO at 6400. The shutter speed was a 400th of a second and the aperture was f/22. At first glance it doesn't appear that this image has a very good composition, but we do have some, because the image does seem to sit quite well within the frame. I think the ferns on the right hand side keep us nicely held in that area, but the trees on the left give us a lead in towards the center, and of course when we're editing the image we can make the center or any other part of the frame a little bit lighter to be able to hold that attention when we get there. With this image I think we have a little more interest, because we're up on a raised ridge looking down into a mini valley and up the other side, and there's no mistaking where our route through this image needs to be. And if the track wasn't doing that job, then the lovely colours of green with the ferns either side are certainly helping out. This is another shot where I allowed the shutter speed to go down to a 30th of a second. In normal circumstances, I would have been using a tripod for these shots, even in the conditions that we can see. But because I was trying out this new camera with the in-body image stabilization, which can talk to the lens, which also has image stabilization, I took a few chances just to see the sort of results I might get. Now the appeal with this image is pretty obvious. It's the light that's coming through those fine green leaves of the bushes in the centre of the frame. But I think the key here was more the image editing. I've allowed the base, the edges and the corners to go quite dark so that those green shapes do dominate the picture. And a little while ago I was talking about exposing to the right, or squeezing as much light into the sensor as possible, so that throughout the image editing I had as much flexibility as possible. Well, here you can see what happens when we do that. The one thing we have to be aware of course, is that the thumbnail doesn't always look that good. But the important factor is all of the raw ingredients are trapped within that raw file. A little bit of work in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw is all we really need. In this shot the composition is a lot stronger for obvious reasons. We've got that dominant rock sitting right over the point where the horizontal and vertical lines cross. A little bit of light coming through at the top centre of the screen. That could be dealt with using content aware fill, the clone tool, or even just burning that tone down a little bit, but I didn't think it was worthwhile because the rest of the image is dominant enough. But on second thoughts, when we actually see the image with the highlights removed, we can see perhaps an improvement. This image does have a much more obvious composition with the two trees on the right. One of the things I found with most of the images I shot in the forest was I had to darken the base of the images, I think practically all of them. Because we've had a period of dry weather, the ground was rather light in colour and it didn't give a good solid base for the images and the trees to stand on. So I could darken the foreground quite considerably, but I'm also a great believer in shading the edges and corners of practically all my images. Nearly every image we do this to, there's a benefit to be had. This was the final image of the day, and I was quite surprised as I was driving down the track to see the roo out that time on a hot afternoon. Usually you see the roos out in the early morning and the evening. I think this one may have been a female. She looked rather plump at the bottom end, although I didn't see any signs of a joey. Assuming that she's a she allowed me to take pictures through the open window of the car, but as soon as I stepped outside, she was away back into the forest. So the object of the exercise here was to improve my familiarity with the Canon R5, but also get a feel for the image stabilization too, hence the hand holding. In normal circumstances, I wouldn't have any issues with using a tripod, but I know they can be a bit of a burden, but a necessary one at times. In contrasty conditions, exposure is always going to be a little bit tricky, but if we just take care with that and we choose our viewpoint carefully, where there's a will, there's a way. Most of my shots were with the 24-105mm lens, but I didn't use the wide end of that lens because that would bring more of those highlights into the frame. If I wanted to use a 24mm or maybe even my 16-35mm Canon lens, then I probably would have waited for an overcast day before venturing into the forest. A friend of mine here on the Sunshine Coast of Australia says that if you want to take pictures and the sun's out, go to the beach. If it's dull and raining, go to the rainforest. He's not wrong, but sometimes we need a challenge. Now this style of video is a little bit different to the style I usually produce, so I'd be interested in any feedback you'd care to give. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm sure you know the drill, but for now, I'll see you next time, perhaps with some more examples of the Canon R5.